On the morning of December 17, 1903, two bicycle mechanics named Orville and Wilbur Wright stood on the beach at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. They flipped a coin to see who would be the first person in human history to fly. Orville won. He climbed aboard their flying machine and sailed into the air for 12 seconds, traveling 120 feet. When word of the Wright brothers' accomplishments spread, it brought cries of amazement from some and fired the imagination of many others. And yet, in 1903, America was a place where most people still did not have electricity and had never seen a car, much less a plane. In such a world, it was impossible to fathom what this new technology might lead to. Perhaps it would be just a novelty, like the kite or the hot air balloon. Or maybe, just maybe, it would change everything. To the Wright brothers, their invention was, above all, a way to prosper. To protect their machine from prying eyes, they quietly retreated to their bicycle shop in Ohio, and at Wilbur's urging, put their plane back under wraps.
While I am taking up the investigation for pleasure rather than profit, I think there is a possibility of achieving fame and fortune from it.
With many others also trying to invent aircraft, Wilbur became obsessed with securing a patent for their plane before the competition stole their ideas. Over the next 5 years, the brothers rarely flew, instead spending their time working on improving their technology.
Wilbur Wright was a very stubborn, a very lonely, a very determined man, a very methodical man who was willing to work for years in obscurity in order to develop a system that made possible flight in a way that no one else had achieved it up to that time.
The Wright brothers' competitors often built a plane one day and tried to fly it the next. But the brothers tested each new approach in their workshop and built the world's first wind tunnel to help them do it. Their breakthrough discovery was a system of control called wing warping. It involved twisting the wings by pulling on them with wires, so that the plane would turn in the desired direction. Wing warping kept the brothers in the sky, even as their competitors came crashing to the ground.
I do not take dangerous chances, both because I have no wish to get hurt, and because a fall would stop my experimenting, which I would not like at all. The man who wishes to keep at the problem long enough to really learn anything positively must not take dangerous risks.
Finally, in 1908, 5 years after their first flight, the Wright brothers' patent was approved. Now they were ready to show the world that they had mastered flight. The place they chose for their international debut was Paris, where French aviators had recently made their own short flights. As a result, the French were claiming that it was in France, not in America, where man first flew. While Blériot hurried to build a new plane, several of his rivals attempted to cross the channel. But powerful winds sent them all crashing into the murky waters. On July 25th, 1909, Blériot's plane was ready. But a fierce storm was rushing through the channel. And the bad weather combined with memories of past crashes to give Blériot second thoughts.
I swear I wasn't in any mood to fly. I would have been happy if I'd been told the wind was blowing so hard there was no point in even trying. I was gripped by an uneasy feeling. What was going to happen? Would I make it to Dover?
Then word came that the storm had cleared. As Blériot worked with his beautiful single-winged aircraft, built in the shape of a dragonfly, his confidence returned.
Now I had courage for two. I thought only of my machine, the engine, the propeller, and everything was ready. I assumed that the flight would lead to victorious success, unless there was an accident. My plane rapidly accelerated and thrust itself above the ocean. Suddenly, the wind and its blasts became stronger in a disturbing fashion. For 10 minutes, I kept on alone in the middle of the vast sea. I finally saw the right side of the English coast. I pointed my plane toward it. At the risk of smashing everything, I cut the ignition at 20 feet. Now, it was up to chance.
Once again, Blériot's flight ended in a crash. Basil Lee Rowe was a former World War I ace who financed his passion for flying by giving rides to first-time passengers. He had a unique approach to testing a town for profitability.
I would buzz it a couple of times. If the people continued about their business, I did the same. But if the kids tried to follow me, I looked for a farmer's field from which to operate. When I found one, I buzzed the town to get the whole population following me like the children of Hamlet following the Pied Piper.
Every time he took somebody aloft, Basil wondered how they would react to their first time flying. One woman thoroughly surprised him.
Once I took up a woman who appeared to be a calm passenger. Suddenly, she shrieked, climbed out of the cockpit, and onto the lower wing like a practiced aerial acrobat. "What's wrong?" I yelled. "Mouse," she yelled back.
It took Basil considerable effort to convince his passenger that a mouse in the cockpit was not nearly as dangerous as wing walking. Basil Rowe may have been willing to put up with anything that would keep him flying. But at $5 a ride, he was never going to get rich. Smith was inspired by his experiences to write the book By the Seat of My Pants, which told of his turbulent life as a mail pilot. He sometimes questioned his own sanity, given that the life expectancy for men in his profession was just 4 years.
Many people think the airmail is the next thing to suicide. I certainly had no wish to get killed, but I was not afraid of it. I would have been frightened if I thought I would get maimed or crippled for life, but there was little chance of that. A male pilot was usually killed outright.
But even with all the danger and misery, Dean Smith loved his job.
What I could never tell was the beauty and exultation of flying itself. Above the haze layer, with the sun behind you or sinking ahead. Alone in an open cockpit, there is nothing and everything to see. Threading one's way through the great piles of summer cumulus that hang over the plains, the cloud shapes are sculptured just for you. The life over the mountain ridges, the steady, pure air at dawn takeoffs. It was so alive and rich a life that any other conceivable choice seemed dull, prosaic, and humdrum.
In 1928, on a goodwill tour of Mexico, Charles Lindbergh paid a visit to the home of the American ambassador. There he met the ambassador's shy, reserved daughter, Anne. Lindbergh, who was himself famous for being shy, couldn't get the young woman out of his mind. Anne Morrow was also taken with him, as she confessed only to her diary.
The idea of this clear, direct, straight boy. How it has swept out of sight all other men I have known. All the pseudo-intellectuals, the sophisticates, the posers. All my life, in fact my world, is smashed.
In 1928, a French pilot and adventurer named Antoine De Saint-Exupery was flying the mail between remote settlements in the Sahara Desert. He was traversing an inhospitable land in a notoriously unreliable World War I surplus plane. And yet, he could not have loved his job more.
Alone, before the tempestuous skies, the pilot defends his mails. They constitute the dogma of his religion, of his craft. The torch which in this aerial race is passed from runner to runner.
The intoxicating experience of soaring day after day across the Sahara inspired Saint-Exupery to spend his nights writing about his love affair with flying.
A pilot's business is with the wind, with the sand, with the stars. He strives to outwit the forces of nature. He looks forward to port as to a promised land. And truth, for him, is what lives in the stars.
For Saint-Exupery, it was a grand adventure. It was also extremely dangerous. On one trip across the Sahara, Saint-Exupery's plane suddenly developed engine trouble. He had to make an emergency landing hundreds of miles from the nearest settlement. Far from despairing, Saint-Exupery decided to take the opportunity to survey his surroundings.
I walked to the top of a sandhill and looked around the horizon like a captain on his bridge. This sea of sand bowled me over. unquestionably, it was filled with mystery and danger. I sat still and stared into space. Something half revealed, yet wholly unknown, had bewitched me. The love of the Sahara, like love itself, is born of a face perceived and never really seen.
When a rescue plane finally located him, Saint-Exupery's engine was repaired, and he continued with his mission. Antoine De Saint-Exupery was a man who faced extraordinary difficulties and triumphed over them. In the late 1920s, there were many others like him, and together they would shape the future of flight. With Charles Lindbergh at the controls, they took off in a revolutionary new plane, the Sikorsky S-38 flying boat. As they island hopped through the Caribbean, the Tripps and Lindberghs were among the first tourists ever to arrive by air. Both Tripp and Lindbergh believed that it was the dawn of a marvelous new era for the people of the Caribbean. But Anne Morrow Lindbergh wasn't so sure. She wrote of her doubts in her diary.
I am rather worried about these islands. I like them because they are as untouched as Nassau used to be. This airline is bringing to them the fate of Nassau. Tourists, drugstores, hotels, but also prosperity, education, sanitation. Why do progress and beauty have to be so opposed?
But for Juan Tripp, there were no such doubts. To him, what was good for Pan Am was good for America and the world. And the United States government seemed to agree. In 1931, the Postmaster General awarded Tripp a monopoly over airmail rights south of the United States. But as it turned out, Pan Am wasn't the only airline that was getting rich on a sweetheart deal with the government. Ever the salesman, Tripp had managed to talk William Gruch into overseeing the expedition.
Supposedly, all we had to do was pile our materials on the ship, send the ship to the island, unload the cargo, and hire a local contractor to construct a station. It wasn't a bit like that. Wake Island turned out to be a uniquely difficult place to build an airport. It is entirely surrounded by coral reefs, and the ship had to unload her cargo in the open sea. There are no local contractors, no workmen. The newspapers dubbed the expedition the modern Robinson Crusoes. But Crusoe picked a better island than we did. At least he had fresh water and fruit.
But Gruch knew that Juan Tripp and Pan Am could not afford for him to fail. And so he and his men set to work. Over the course of 9 lonely months, they transformed the 3-square-mile island from an almost barren, uninhabited wasteland into a bustling town with streets, dock, and seaport. The media may have portrayed it as glamorous, but the reality was different. Even for the newest planes, flying was still a low-altitude, turbulent affair. One of the stewardess's jobs was to help airsick passengers to use paper bags called herb cups. Pilot Ernest K. Gann witnessed firsthand what the stewardess had to go through.
The air is often annoyingly potted with a number of minor vertical disturbances which sicken the passengers. The airplanes smell of disinfectant, feces, and puke. The stewardesses, short-tempered and reeking of vomit, come forward as often as they can for what is a breath of comparatively fresh air.
For passengers who were still interested in eating, the meal invariably consisted of fried chicken. Stewardesses helped carry luggage on board, screw down loose seats, and most importantly, make sure disoriented passengers did not mistake the exit door for the lavatory. In the history of flight, there have always been the many who view flying as transportation. And there have been the few, like Antoine De Saint-Exupery, who live for their next moment in a plane. In 1941, the man who had loved soaring over the Sahara was miserable, for he was now exiled to New York City. Saint-Exupery had fled France when the Nazis took over. He came to America hoping to convince the Air Force to give him a fighter to fly against the Germans. But with Saint-Exupery 10 years older than the approved age for pilots, he was turned down. For 2 long years, he was heartbroken.
My offense is to be living in New York while my people are at war and dying. Why won't they let me climb into a warplane?
Saint-Exupery consoled himself by writing about a time when he was flying. He began writing and illustrating a new book, The Little Prince, which would become his most famous work. In it, while broken down and lost in the midst of the Sahara, he meets a tiny prince from another world, traveling the universe, trying to understand life.
He asked me, "What is that object?" I said, "It flies. It is my airplane." And I was proud to have him learn that I could fly. He cried out then, "What? You dropped down from the sky?" "Yes." "Oh, that is funny." And the little prince broke into a lovely peal of laughter, which irritated me very much. I like my misfortunes to be taken seriously.
In the book, the little prince discovers the true meaning of life.
And now, here is my secret. A very simple secret. It is only with the heart that one can see truly.
At the end of his conversation with the little prince, the aviator manages to fix his plane, and both he and the little prince continue on their way. In 1944, Saint-Exupery finally got his wish. He went back to North Africa to fly a warplane for his country. On July 31st, Saint-Exupery took off on a mission. He never returned. In his life, Saint-Exupery had seen flying transformed. From biplanes carrying only pilots to sleek metal birds carrying millions of people. It was a transformation brought about by a determined band of visionaries. And in his own way, Saint-Exupery was one of them. The poet laureate of a time when flight was changed forever. In the summer of 1925, a young man and his bride traveled by private rail car to Los Angeles. They brought with them parcels from Cartier and Tiffany, $50,000 in cash, and 2 automobiles. It was an arranged marriage, one forced on the young man by relatives after his overbearing mother and millionaire father passed away. It would prove to be a futile attempt to control it for this 20-year-old was about to take the airline business by storm. Howard Hughes had arrived. Hughes' love for flying was rooted in a secret. Due to a childhood illness, he was practically deaf and heard a continual ringing in his ears. Too proud to wear a hearing aid, Hughes was only truly happy in the cockpit of a plane. There, the ringing in his ears was masked by the roar of the engine, and he left the world behind. In 1933, he founded the Hughes Aircraft Company for the sole purpose of building fast planes for him to fly. His triumph was the H-1 Racer. Hughes liked to call it, "My beautiful little thing." The paranoid Hughes demanded that before sending constellation reports back to TWA, Guy remove sensitive information from the papers in case they fell into the wrong hands.
I couldn't even tell my wife and family what I was really doing in Burbank. When letters, drawings, and other Lockheed data came to Cypress Street, I would take a razor blade and cut out all the names and company identification. Some of the documents would look like Swiss cheese.
Hughes' obsession with security infected everyone on the project. John Guy anxiously searched for places to confer where agents from rival airlines could not overhear the latest plans.
To avoid drawing attention, we would meet at places like Griffith Park with data for the constellation. If someone approached, we would hastily move on.
But all of Hughes' attempts at secrecy would be in vain. The man who invented the jet engine was born to a working-class family in Coventry, England, in 1907. Frank Whittle's earliest memory was of lying on the floor, watching his favorite toy, a wind-up Blériot airplane.
Its propeller was driven by clockwork, and it was much too heavy for a flying model. But it could be suspended from a bracket, and it would perform a circle until the spring ran down. It is linked in my mind with memories of occasional flights over Coventry by early aviators.
Whittle became one of the RAF's best pilots. But when he wasn't flying planes, he was trying to figure out how they could travel faster than ever before. The young officer soon hit on a novel idea: use high-pressure gases to create a jet-propelled engine. Whittle's idea was a burst of genius. He was convinced it could work, and his superiors were very impressed. They arranged a meeting in London with RAF experts who were skeptical of the young officer's theories.
I was instructed to report to the Air Ministry with my sketches and calculations. I explained my ideas to W.L. Tweedy and to Dr. A.A. Griffith.
Whittle's proposed engine drew compressed air into a combustion chamber, where it was mixed with fuel and ignited. As the resulting hot gas blasted out the back of the chamber, it pushed the engine forward. But the experts thought that Whittle was an impractical dreamer.
I left in rather low spirits. It was pointed out that certain of my assumptions were over-optimistic and that I'd made a mistake in my calculations. The Air Ministry said that materials did not exist capable of withstanding the high temperature and high stresses which a gas turbine would create.
He felt very disappointed, knocked right down.
Six years later, several of Whittle's RAF colleagues decided to invest in his idea. They set up a company in the town of Rugby called Power Jets Limited. In 1937, Power Jets built the WU, the Whittle Unit. The unwieldy contraption couldn't possibly fit in a plane, but it would demonstrate whether jet propulsion was feasible. Whittle and his team were unable to afford safety equipment. When they tested the engine for the first time, they were knowingly risking their lives.
When the starter motor had raised the speed to about 1,000 RPM, I opened the control valve, which admitted fuel to the combustion chamber. For a second or two, the speed of the engine increased slowly. Then, with a rising shriek like an air raid siren, the speed began to rise rapidly. Fortunately, the acceleration ceased. This incident did not do my nervous system any good at all. I have rarely been so frightened.
Whittle's investors were frightened as well, and the funding for his work began to dry up. Deeply frustrated, he retreated to his office in a Gothic manor called Brownsover Hall. Whittle spent countless hours trying to solve the design problems of the WU. During months of uncertainty, he suffered from debilitating headaches and became addicted to painkillers and tranquilizers. But just as the health of Whittle and his project were about to collapse, his fortune changed. Stressed and exhausted, Whittle also decided to leave the company. He returned to Brownsover Hall and drafted his letter of resignation.
To me, what has happened is little short of a tragedy. The engineering team which launched the aircraft turbine has been bludgeoned into ineffectiveness. No team had a greater right to carry on doing the work for which it was most fitted, yet their reward is bitterness and resentment.
Soon after resigning, Whittle suffered a nervous breakdown and was hospitalized. In 1948, the RAF informed him that due to his ill health, Whittle had to retire from the service in which he had spent all of his adult life. The 747 was an airplane so much larger than any that had been built before that it boggled the mind to think it could fly. Its body seemed to stretch as far as the eye could see. It was grand, in the spirit of ocean liners from a bygone era. It promised to carry more people to foreign lands than any airplane ever. And yet, the 747 came within an eyelash of bankrupting the largest aircraft manufacturer in the world. This is the story of how an airplane went from ugly duckling to swan. Although they were too suspicious of each other to become close friends, Juan Trippe and William Allen often vacationed together. Their most important trip of all, a fishing vacation off the coast of Alaska, was recounted in the book, Birds of Prey.
They hired a classic old yacht, Wild Goose, owned by John Wayne and rented out to rich tycoons, who hoped perhaps that some of the old movie cowboys' grit would rub off on their commercial adventures. Their wives went along for the trip, but this was basically a man's holiday, an exercise in commercial machismo. Between jousting over the merits of different fishing grounds and over which line and tackle to use, the two men explored the idea of the new plane. Eventually, it came down to a kind of dare. "If you build it, I'll buy it," said Trippe.
At his home in Seattle, William Allen, the president of Boeing, couldn't sleep. He was tormented by the prospect that his decision to make the 747 was going to destroy Boeing. Late at night, Allen wrote about this nightmare scenario.
January 31st, 1970. I must not let these monumental problems destroy me. The magnitude of the risk and the capital required were sufficiently great that we knew it would be a strain on the Boeing company. I must face the problems without flinching. Do what is best for the creditors, customers, stockholders, and employees. I must learn to live with this critical situation until it is solved.
For several years, Boeing teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. But then, orders for the jumbo jet began to roll in. Ultimately, building the 747 turned out to be one of the best investments the company had ever made. Above all, Trippe had been a visionary, and the movement that he started, flying more people cheaper, was soon going to take the world of flying by storm. In the 1960s, America's domestic airlines seemed poised for the same kind of boom Pan Am was experiencing. There was only one thing standing in the way. Their tickets cost too much. Since the 1930s, the U.S. government had been regulating ticket prices, setting them artificially high to ensure that companies like United, American, and Eastern would thrive.
The government passed through automatic price increases so that the airline men could pay for this cool new equipment that they wanted to have, the latest and best in their fleet. And the consequence of that was that there were a lot of really cool airplanes flying.
Far from getting better, things kept getting worse. By the early 1970s, the government's Civil Aeronautics Board was regulating not just ticket prices, but nearly every aspect of flying. At the CAB office in Washington, D.C., the overworked head of the agency, Alfred Kahn, was charged with making decisions from the very mundane to the downright confusing.
May a carrier transport horses from Florida to somewhere in the Northeast? Scheduled carrier pick up stranded charter customers and carry them on seats that would otherwise be empty? Is it any wonder that I ask myself every day, is this action necessary? Employees of two affiliated airlines wear similar-looking uniforms? Is this what my mother raised me to do?
One thing was clear to Alfred Kahn. Regulation was ruining the industry. Kahn began lobbying Congress to change things. But how? Out in Texas, one tiny airline had come up with an answer. The year was 1966. The place, a fancy club in San Antonio. Roland King had a dream of starting an airline. He figured that the one person crazy enough to help him pull off this audacious plan was his friend, Herb Kelleher. They decided to discuss the idea over cocktails. When he had Kelleher right where he wanted him, King made his pitch.
Because we'd fly only in Texas, we wouldn't be subject to Civil Aeronautics Board restrictions, and that offers all sorts of blessings and benefits right there.
Then Roland grabbed a cocktail napkin and drew a triangle. On each corner, he put one of the three biggest cities in Texas.
You got to have a commercially booming state with some really big cities far enough apart to make bus or car travel inconvenient. Offhand, I can't think of but two states like that. California's one. The other state is Texas, Herb, and we don't have an airline like that. We could offer rates so low, people would fly instead of drive.
Herb Kelleher had to think about it. He decided it was a crazy idea, and that he was all for it.
Herb Kelleher and the people that founded Southwest Airlines with him deserve the credit for understanding that there was a price point.
At the same time that aviation was making a break with its past, two of the giants who had started it all were on the verge of leaving the scene. In July of 1974, Charles Lindbergh was in a hospital in New York City, suffering from lymphatic cancer. His doctors told him that he had only 2 weeks to live. Lindbergh wanted to tell his old friend Juan Trippe that the end was near. The paths of the two men had been intertwined for over 40 years. They had traveled the world together, with Lindbergh serving as Trippe's advisor. Each of their journeys driven by the shared belief that aviation could benefit mankind. Now, it was time to say goodbye. According to Trippe's secretary, the men talked for 2 hours. Trippe just sat in his chair, with tears pouring down his face. After taking care of his goodbyes, Lindbergh had just one more wish: to spend his last days in his beloved Hawaii. Against his doctor's orders, Lindbergh boarded a DC-8 bound for Maui. His last flight reminded his wife Anne of his pioneering transatlantic trip. She said no one believed he could do either and survive. Lindbergh was sustained by his faith that his connection to flying would be an eternal one.
After my death, the molecules of my being will return to the earth and sky. They came from the stars. I am of the stars.
After 9 days in Maui, Charles Lindbergh died. Juan Trippe, now retired, was about to suffer another loss: Pan Am. Throughout the history of commercial aviation, the greatest leaps forward in safety have been driven by the worst disasters. The crash triggered an uproar, one that led in 1965 to the installation of computers to make the skies safer. All of that was changed by computers. Not only did they improve the quality of radar, they gave controllers three-dimensional information, showing an airplane's altitude as well as its location. According to one controller, it required a special kind of individual to master the new technology.
It was like being inside a video game. It was always something different. When I worked the airplanes, switching them in and out, I'd have problems I had to pose instant solutions for, and they had to work. We used a sixth sense, one the computers will never have. We had to learn to flow with the traffic, as if it were an art form or part of some piece of music. You had to be the best controller in the facility or well on your way to claiming the title. The Clint Eastwood syndrome was alive and well where we worked.
What an incredible thing it is to fly. Every year at the Oshkosh Air Show in Wisconsin, people from all over the world come to pay homage to flight and to see the skies filled with every aircraft imaginable. Here, it is easy to remember the early days of aviation and the pioneers that had unlimited dreams of what flying could do for mankind. One of those dreamers was the French aviator Antoine De Saint-Exupery. He believed aviation would bring people closer together.
The central struggle of men has been to understand one another, to join together. And it is this very thing that the airplane helps them to do. It begins by annihilating time and space.
For Charles Lindbergh, traveling in a plane to far-off places was a way to explore the meaning of his own life.
I may be flying a complicated airplane, rushing through space. But in this cabin, I am surrounded by simplicity and thoughts set free of time. The grandeur of the world outside, the nearness of death, the longness of life.
For the painter Georgia O'Keeffe, the most interesting part of all was the view.
It is breathtaking to rise up over the world one has been living in, all simplified and clear-cut in patterns which time and history will straighten out. I cannot help feeling that it would do something wonderful for the human race, rid it of much smallness and pettiness, if more people flew.
We are now a century removed from the birth of powered flight. During that time, the dreams and accomplishments of aviation's visionaries have transformed the way we live. And yet, ironically, most of us take this astounding invention for granted. In such an era, perhaps it is too much to expect that our thoughts fill with joy and hope each time we board a plane. But maybe it's not too much to suggest that the next time you fly, you ask for a window seat, keep the shade open, and enjoy the view.